You write, quote, "We'll start our pitchfork tour in this chapter by taking a brief trip through the history of the Republican Party. Then, in the following chapters, we'll take a Tim's career-tanking deep dive into America's social justice movement," as you started to talk about. Okay, so let's go. What's the history of the Republican Party?
I'm looking at this through my vertical ladder. I'm saying, what is this familiar story of the Republicans from the 60s to today? What does it look like through the vertical lens, right? Does it look different? And is there an interesting story here that's been kind of hidden because we're always looking at the horizontal? Now, the horizontal story, you'll hear people talk about it, and they'll say something like the Republicans have moved farther and farther to the right. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's not really true. Like, was Trump more right wing than Reagan? I don't think so. I think he's less.
Actual policy, yeah.
Yeah. So we're using this again. It's just like you're calling yourself centrist when it's not exactly what you mean, even though it also is.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, look, this vertical lens helps with other things. Let's apply it to the Republicans. And here's what I saw is I looked at the 60s and I saw an interesting story, which is I don't think that, not everyone's familiar with like what happened in the early 60s, but in 1960, the Republican Party was it was a plurality. You had progressives, like genuine, Rockefeller, pretty progressive people, all the way to, then you had the, moderates like Eisenhower and Dewey. And then you go all the way to the, farther right, you had Goldwater and, what you might call, I call them the fundamentalists. And so it's this interesting plurality, right? Something we don't have today. And what happened was the Goldwater contingent, which was the underdog, they were small, right? Eisenhower was the president, had just been the president, and it seemed like the moderates were, he said you have to be close to the center of the chessboard. That's how you maintain power. These people were very far from the center of the chessboard, but they ended up basically have like a hostile takeover. They conquered their own party, and they did it by breaking all of the kind of unwritten rules and norms. So they did things like they first started with like the college Republicans, which was like this feeder group that turned in, a lot of the politicians started there. And they went to the election and they wouldn't let the current president, the incumbent, speak. And they were throwing chairs and they were fist fights. And eventually people gave up and they just sat there and they sat in the chair talking for, their candidate until everyone eventually left, and then they declared victory. So they came in. There was a certain set of rules, agreed upon rules, and they came in playing the power games, saying, "Well, actually, if we do this, you won't have the power. We have the power to take it if we just break all the rules, right?" And so they did, and they won, and that became this hugely influential thing. Which then they conquered California through, again, these people were taken aback. These proper Republican candidates were appalled by the kind of like the insults that were being hurled at them and the intimidation and the bullying. And eventually they ended up in the National Convention, which was called like the right-wing Woodstock. It was like, the Republican National Convention in 1964 was just, there was jeering, and they wouldn't let the moderates or the progressives even speak. And there was racism. Jackie Robinson was there, and he was a proud Republican. And he said that like, he feels like he was a Jew in Hitler's Germany with the way that blacks were being treated there. And it was nasty. But what did they do? They had fiery, plurality enough to win, and they won. They ended up getting crushed in the general election, and they kind of faded away. But to me, I was like, that was an interesting story. I see it as, I have this character in the book called the Golem, which is a big, dumb, powerful monster that's the emergent property of like a political echo chamber. It's like this big giant. It's stupid, but it's powerful and scary. And to me, I was like, a golem rose up, conquered the party for a second, knocked it on its ass, and then faded away. Mm-hmm. And to me, when I look at the Trump revolution and not just Trump, the last 20 years, I see that same lower right monster kind of making another charge for it, but this time succeeding and really taking over the party for a long period of time. I see the same story, which is the power games are being played in a situation when it had always been, the government relies on all these unwritten rules and norms to function. But for example, you have in 2016, Merrick Garland gets nominated by Obama, and the unwritten norm says that when the president nominates a justice, then you pass them through unless there's some egregious thing. That's what has happened. But they said, actually, this is the last year of his presidency and the people should choose. I don't think we should set a new precedent where the president can't nominate a Supreme Court justice in the last year. So they pass it through, and it ends up being Gorsuch. And so they lose that seat. Now, 3 years later, it's Trump's last year, and it's another election year, and Ginsburg dies. And what did they say? They say, oh, let's keep our precedent. They said, no, actually, we changed our mind. We're going to nominate Amy Barrett. So to me, that is classic power games, right? There's no actual rule, and what you're doing is they did technically have the power to block the nomination then, and then they technically had the power to put someone, and they're pretending there's some principle to it, but they're just extra. They're going for a short-term edge at the expense of what is like the workings of the system in the long run. And then what do the Democrats have to do in that situation? Because both parties have been doing this, is they either can lose now all the time or they start playing the power games too. And now you have a prisoner's dilemma where it's like both end up doing this thing and everyone ends up worse off. The debt ceiling, all these power plays that are being made with these holding the country hostage. This is power games. And to me, that's what Goldwater was doing in the 60s, but it was a healthier time in a way because there was this plurality within the parties, reduced some of the national tribalism, and that there wasn't as much of an appeal to that. But today, it's just like, do whatever you have to do to beat the enemies. And so I'm seeing a rise in power games. And I talk about the Republicans because they did a lot of these things first. They have been a little bit more egregious, but both parties have been doing it over the last 20, 30 years.
Can you place blame, or maybe there's a different term for it, at the subsystems of this? So is it the media? Is it the politicians like in the Senate and in Congress? Is it Trump, so the leadership? Is it, or maybe it's us, human beings? Maybe social media versus mainstream media? Is there a sense of what is the cause and what is the symptom?
It's very complex. So Ezra Klein has a great book, Why We're Polarized, where he talks about a lot of this. And there's some of these are, it's really no one's fault. First of all, it's the environment has changed in a bunch of ways you just mentioned. And what happens when you take human nature, which is a constant, and you put it into an environment, behavior comes out. The environment's the independent variable. When that changes, the dependent variable, the behavior, changes with it, right? And so the environment has changed in a lot of ways. So one major one is, it used to, for a long time, actually, the first it was the Republicans, and then the Democrats just had a stranglehold on on Congress. It was not even competitive. The Democrats for 40 years had the majority. And so therefore, it actually is a decent environment to compromise in. Because now we can both, what you want is Congress people thinking about their home district and voting yes on a national policy because we're going to get a good deal on it back at home. That's actually healthy, as opposed to voting in lockstep together because this is what the red party is doing, regardless of what's good for my home district. An example is Obamacare. There were certain Republican districts that would have actually officially been benefited by Obamacare, but every Republican voted against it. So, and part of the reason is because there's no longer this obvious majority. Every few years it switches. It's a 50-50 thing. And that's, partially because it's become so, we've been so subsumed with this one national divide of left versus right that people are whoever, they're voting for the same party for president all the way down the ticket now. And so you have this just kind of 50-50 color war, and that's awful for compromise. So there's like 10 of these things, that have redistricting. But also, it is social media. It is, I call it hypercharged tribalism. In the 60s, you had kind of distributed tribalism. You had some people that are worked up about the USSR, right? They're national. That's what they care about. U.S. versus foreign. You had some people that were saying left versus right, like they are today. And then other people that were saying that they were fighting within the party. Mm-hmm. But today you don't have that. You have ideological realignment, so you kind of got rid of a lot of the in-party fighting, and then hasn't been that big of a foreign threat, nothing like the USSR for a long time. So you kind of lost that, and what's left is just this left versus right thing, and so that's kind of this hypercharged whirlpool that subsumes everything, and so it's. People point to Newt Gingrich. And people there's certain characters that enacted policies that stoked this kind of thing. But I think this is a much bigger kind of environmental shift.